Hello and welcome to the Sleepy Explanation. I'm so glad you're here. If you're settling into bed, curling up on the couch, or just trying to wind down after a long day of being a human, you've come to the right place. This is a quiet little corner of the internet where science gets soft-spoken and curiosity puts on pajamas. Tonight, we're exploring whether animals understand death. And hey, if you enjoy these slow science journeys and you'd like to help this sleepy little channel grow, I'd be ever so grateful if you tapped the like button, subscribed, or even just left a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the night. All right, take a deep breath, let it out slowly. Let's begin. Picture this. It's a quiet afternoon in the African savannah when a young elephant suddenly stops walking. The matriarch of the herd has collapsed, her massive body still beneath the acacia trees. What happens next might surprise you. The other elephants don't simply walk away. They don't treat her like an obstacle to step around. Instead, they gather. They touch her with their trunks, almost like they're checking for something, for breath, for warmth, for some sign that she might still be there. Hours pass, some of them stay with her through the night. This scene raises one of the most fascinating questions in animal behaviour. Do they know what just happened? Do they understand that their matriarch isn't just sleeping, isn't just hurt, but is gone in a way that can't be fixed? For the longest time, humans believed we were the only species cursed with the knowledge of our own mortality. We thought we were alone in understanding that life has an ending, that every heartbeat brings us closer to a final silence. It was part of what made us special, we told ourselves. This terrible, beautiful awareness of death. But over the past few decades, scientists have been watching animals more carefully. And what they've discovered is forcing us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about death, consciousness, and what it means to truly understand that something precious can be lost forever. The question isn't just academic curiosity, it touches something deep in how we see ourselves and our place in the world. If animals understand death, what does that say about their inner lives? About their capacity for grief, for fear, for that particular kind of love that comes from knowing something won't last forever? Tonight we're going to take a gentle journey through the evidence, the mysteries, and the surprising ways that creatures across the animal kingdom seem to grapple with the reality of mortality. It's a story that will make you see the natural world, and maybe yourself, in a completely different light. Before we dive into elephant funerals and grieving chimpanzees, we need to pause and ask a surprisingly tricky question. What exactly does it mean to understand death? Think about it for a moment. When you were very young, you probably encountered death in some form. Maybe a pet, maybe a grandparent, maybe even just a dead bird in the backyard. But understanding what had happened didn't come all at once. First, you might have learned that the creature couldn't move anymore. Then maybe that it wouldn't wake up. Eventually, the harder truth, that it would never move or wake up again. Scientists call this the development of a death concept, and they've identified several key components. First, there's universality, the understanding that all living things die. Then inevitability, that death will happen to everyone eventually. There's also irreversibility, that death is permanent, not like sleep or being unconscious. And finally, there's non-functionality, that dead things can't do the things living things do. For humans, we don't fully grasp all these concepts until we're around 7 or 8 years old. Before that, we might think death is like a really long nap, or that maybe if we're very good, we won't have to die, or that dead people might still be able to hear us or get hungry or cold. So when we ask whether animals understand death, we're really asking, can they grasp any of these concepts? Do they know that death is different from sleep? Do they understand that it's permanent? Do they recognise that it will eventually happen to them too? The challenge is that we can't exactly sit down with a dolphin and have a philosophical conversation about mortality. We can't give a chimpanzee a questionnaire about whether they think death is reversible. Instead, scientists have to be detectives, looking for clues in behaviour, in the choices animals make when confronted with death. And here's where it gets really interesting. Even among humans, understanding death isn't just an intellectual exercise, it's deeply emotional. The moment we truly grasp that we and everyone we love will die, we don't just file that information away like a math fact, we feel it. It changes how we love, how we live, how we hold on to moments. So when we see animals exhibiting what looks like grief, what appears to be mourning, what seems like an emotional response to death, we have to ask ourselves, are they just following instincts? Or are they feeling something that we recognise as profoundly similar to our own deepest emotions? The answer, as we'll see, is more complex and more beautiful than you might expect. If you want to see an animal that seems to understand death in ways that will give you chills, look no further than elephants. These gentle giants have been observed engaging in behaviours around death that are so human-like, so ritualistic, so seemingly full of meaning, that they've forced scientists to completely reconsider what we think we know about animal consciousness. Let me tell you about a scene that researchers witnessed in Kenya's Amboseli National Park. An elderly matriarch named Echo had been the leader of her family for decades. When she finally died, her family didn't just acknowledge her death. They held what can only be described as a vigil. For hours they stood around her body. They touched her with their trunks, exploring her face, her tusks, the familiar contours of someone who had led them to water sources and safe places for so many years. They didn't eat. They didn't move on to find food or water. Even though both were desperately needed, they simply stayed. But here's what really gets to you. When Echo's adult daughter Enid approached the body, she tried to lift her mother's head with her tusks. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly, as if she couldn't quite accept that Echo wouldn't respond, wouldn't get up, wouldn't lead them on just one more journey across the savannah. This isn't unusual behaviour for elephants. They've been observed covering their dead with branches and leaves, almost like a burial. They return to the bones of their deceased family members, sometimes years later, touching them with what can only be described as reverence. They seem to recognise the bones of their own species, even when they encounter the remains of elephants they never knew. Dr. Joyce Poole, who has studied elephants for over 4 decades, describes watching elephants discover elephant bones in the wild. They don't treat these bones like they treat the bones of other animals. Instead, they examine them carefully, almost delicately. They pick them up, turn them over, sometimes even carry them for short distances before setting them down again. What's remarkable is that elephants seem to understand that these bones represent something significant. Not just objects, but remnants of beings like themselves. They don't show this same careful attention to the bones of zebras or antelope. It's as if they recognise death as something that happens specifically to elephants, to beings like them. There's also the story of a young elephant who died in Zimbabwe. His mother stayed with the body for 2 days, repeatedly trying to get him to stand, to nurse, to move. She used her trunk to lift his head, pushed against his body with her massive bulk. When she finally had to leave with the herd to find water, she kept looking back, trumpeting calls that sounded exactly like the contact calls elephants use to stay in touch with separated family members. Scientists have documented elephants appearing to mourn not just for days, but for years. They've seen elephant mothers carrying the bones of their dead calves, unable or unwilling to let go. They've watched as entire herds alter their travel routes to visit the bones of deceased family members. But perhaps the most haunting behaviour is how elephants respond to elephant graveyards, places where elephants have died naturally over many years. When a herd encounters these sites, they often become very quiet, very still. They move slowly through the area, touching various bones with their trunks. It's almost reverent, like humans visiting a cemetery. The question that keeps researchers awake at night is this: are these behaviours just complex instincts, Evolved responses that help the species survive? Or do they represent something deeper, a genuine understanding that death is permanent? That these bones once belonged to beings who lived and breathed and felt? Just like they do, the evidence suggests it might be both, and that's what makes it so remarkable. If elephants make us wonder about animal consciousness, primates make us face some uncomfortable truths about ourselves. After all, we share over 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, and when you watch them respond to death, the similarities are sometimes almost too familiar to bear. Let me tell you about a chimpanzee named Dorothy, who lived at the Sandia Zoo in Cameroon. When Dorothy died at the age of 40, something extraordinary happened. The other chimpanzees in her group, who had been her family for decades, gathered around her body. But they didn't just gather, they formed what can only be described as a funeral procession. One by one, they approached Dorothy's body. They touched her face gently with their hands. Some of them embraced her, holding her close in what looked exactly like a final goodbye. Perhaps most remarkably, they were completely silent. If you've ever been around chimpanzees, you know they're typically very vocal, very active creatures. But in Dorothy's presence, they were hushed, still, almost reverent. The scene was captured on video, and when scientists around the world saw it, many had to admit that what they were witnessing looked indistinguishable from human grief. This isn't an isolated incident. Researchers have documented numerous cases of chimpanzees, bonobos, and other primates showing what appears to be profound emotional responses to death. Dr. James Anderson, who studies primate behaviour, has observed chimpanzee mothers carrying their dead infants for days, sometimes weeks, refusing to put them down even as decomposition begins. What's particularly striking is how other members of the group respond to these grieving mothers. Instead of forcing them to abandon the bodies or treating them as if they're behaving strangely, the group often becomes more protective, more gentle. They seem to understand that something important is happening, that this behaviour serves some deeper purpose. In one documented case, a female chimpanzee named Gia at the Bossou research site in Guinea carried her dead infant for 27 days. The other chimpanzees in the group didn't just tolerate this behaviour, they actively supported it. They shared food with Jaya more frequently, groomed her more often, and seemed to take turns helping her care for the body when she needed to rest. Bonobos, our other closest relatives, show similar behaviours. When a bonobo named Cooney died at the Milwaukee County Zoo, her longtime companion, Lodi, stayed by her side for hours. He groomed her repeatedly, tried to coax her to move, and when keepers finally removed the body, Lodi searched the enclosure for days, calling out with the same vocalizations he had used to communicate with Cooney when they were separated. But here's what makes primate death awareness particularly fascinating. Many of these species pass the mirror test, meaning they recognize themselves in mirrors. They have what scientists call self-awareness. And if you can recognize yourself, if you understand that you exist as an individual being, it's not a huge leap to understanding that individual beings can cease to exist. Dr. Frans de Waal, one of the world's leading primatologists, argues that the capacity for empathy in primates is so well developed that they may actually understand death in ways that are remarkably similar to humans. They seem to grasp that death represents the end of a relationship, the permanent loss of a social bond that can never be restored. There's also evidence that some primates may understand that death can happen to them. Chimpanzees in the wild have been observed showing extreme caution around dead members of their own species, approaching carefully, almost fearfully. This suggests they might understand not just that death has occurred, but that it's something that could happen to them too. In captivity, some primates have been taught sign language, and their descriptions of death are heartbreakingly familiar. Coco the gorilla, when her pet kitten died, signed bad, sad, bad, and frown, cry, frown, sad. When asked where her kitten had gone, she signed sleep. It's almost like looking into a mirror and seeing our own earlier struggles to understand mortality reflected back at us. Just when you think you've wrapped your head around elephant funerals and chimpanzee grief, the natural world throws you a curveball. It turns out that behaviours suggesting death awareness show up in some truly unexpected places across the animal kingdom. Take dolphins, for instance. These ocean dwellers have been observed engaging in what researchers call epimelectic behaviour, essentially caring for dead or dying members of their pod. But it goes beyond simple care. Dolphins have been seen lifting deceased calves to the surface repeatedly, as if trying to help them breathe. They've been observed carrying dead pod members for hours, even days, supporting them with their bodies as they swim. In one particularly moving case documented off the coast of Portugal, a group of dolphins was observed with a deceased calf. For over an hour, different members of the pod took turns supporting the small body, bringing it to the surface, swimming alongside it. The mother would occasionally take the calf from the others, holding it close to her body, as if trying to nurse it back to life. What makes this behaviour especially intriguing is that dolphins are highly intelligent marine mammals with complex social structures. They recognise themselves in mirrors, they have individual names, signature whistles, and they've been observed using tools. When you combine this cognitive capacity with their apparent grief responses, it suggests they might understand that death represents a fundamental change in the nature of a relationship. Whales show similar behaviours. Orcas in particular have been documented carrying their dead calves for extended periods. In 2018, a female orca named Tahlequah made international headlines when she carried her dead calf for 17 days, swimming over 1,000 miles. The image of this mother whale refusing to let go of her baby touched people around the world because it looked so much like grief that we recognise in ourselves. But it's not just marine mammals. Some birds display remarkably sophisticated responses to death as well. Ravens and crows, already known for their intelligence, engage in what can only be described as crow funerals. When a crow dies, other crows gather around the body in large numbers, calling loudly and aggressively. They don't just happen upon the scene, they actively recruit other crows to join the gathering. Researchers initially thought this might be a way to learn about potential dangers in the area, but the behaviour is so consistent, so ritualistic, that some scientists now believe it might represent a form of communal mourning, or at least recognition of death as a significant event. Magpies, close relatives of crows, have been observed bringing grasses and flowers to place near their dead, almost like creating a memorial. They've been seen standing in silence around deceased flock members, occasionally touching the body with their beaks before moving away. Even more surprising are reports from the world of domestic animals. Dog owners have long reported that their pets seem to understand when other pets in the household have died. Dogs have been observed searching for deceased companions, showing signs of depression, and even refusing to eat in familiar spots where their companion used to join them. Cats, despite their reputation for aloofness, sometimes show similar behaviours. There are documented cases of cats sitting vigil beside deceased feline companions, grooming them long after death, or returning repeatedly to places where their companion used to spend time. Perhaps most remarkably, there are even reports of interspecies mourning. Elephants have been observed showing interest in the bodies of dead humans, covering them with branches and leaves in the same way they treat their own dead. Dogs have been known to grieve for cats, horses for goats, and even some birds for human caretakers. What's happening here seems to go beyond simple instinct or confusion. These animals appear to recognise that death represents a permanent change, a loss that can't be undone. They're not just noticing that another animal has stopped moving, they're responding to the absence of a relationship, the end of a social bond. The fact that such behaviours appear across so many different species, with such different evolutionary histories and brain structures, suggests that the capacity to recognise and respond emotionally to death might be more fundamental to consciousness than we ever imagined. Now, Let's take a step back and ask the question that keeps animal behaviourists up at night. How do we know when we're looking at genuine grief and death awareness versus simple confusion or instinctual behaviour? It's a fair question, and it's one that scientists take very seriously. After all, we don't want to project our own emotions onto animals, reading human feelings into behaviours that might have completely different explanations. This tendency, called anthropomorphism, has been a concern in animal research for decades. But here's the thing. The more carefully researchers study animal responses to death, the more sophisticated these responses appear to be. They're not just random reactions. They follow patterns, they involve decision-making, and they often require significant changes in normal behaviour that would seem to work against an animal's immediate survival interests. Dr. Barbara King, an anthropologist who has studied animal grief extensively, points out that true grief involves several key components that we can actually observe and measure. First, there's a disruption of normal routine. The grieving animal stops eating normally, stops engaging in typical social behaviours, stops following usual patterns of activity. Second, there's what scientists call searching behaviour. The animal actively looks for the deceased, often returning to places where they spent time together, calling out with vocalizations they used to use for that specific individual. Third, there's a social component. Other animals in the group often respond to the grieving individual differently, sometimes offering what appears to be comfort or support. And finally, there's duration. These behaviours persist over time, often for weeks or months, which suggests they're not just momentary confusion about why another animal isn't moving. When researchers apply these criteria to the behaviours we've been discussing, many of them meet the scientific definition of grief. The elephant mother who carries her dead calf for days isn't just confused. She's actively choosing to continue a caregiving behaviour that requires significant energy and prevents her from engaging in other necessary activities like foraging efficiently. The dolphin pod that takes turns supporting a dead calf is making collective decisions that require coordination and cooperation, suggesting a shared understanding that something significant has happened that requires a response. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from neurobiological research. Scientists have discovered that many animals have brain structures that are remarkably similar to the ones involved in human emotional processing. The limbic system, which plays a crucial role in how we experience grief, is found in mammals, birds, and even some reptiles. Dr. Jaak Panksepp, a pioneering researcher in animal emotions, identified what he called panic grief systems in the brains of various species. These neural circuits are activated when animals are separated from important social partners, and they're the same circuits that become active when we experience grief and loss. When researchers study the brains of grieving animals, they find changes in neurotransmitter levels, stress hormones, and brain activity patterns that are strikingly similar to what happens in grieving humans. This suggests that the experience of loss might be more universal across species than we ever imagined. Of course, there are still skeptics. Some researchers argue that what we're interpreting as grief might actually be adaptive behaviours that help animals learn about dangers in their environment or maintain social bonds with living group members. They point out that carrying dead offspring, for instance, might serve an evolutionary purpose by allowing the animal to gradually accept the loss rather than abandoning caregiving behaviours too quickly. But even these more cautious interpretations don't necessarily rule out genuine emotional experiences. After all, many human behaviours serve adaptive purposes while still involving real feelings. The fact that grief might be evolutionarily useful doesn't make it any less genuine. What's becoming increasingly clear is that the line between human and animal emotional experiences might be much blurrier than we once thought. We're not the only species that forms deep social bonds, and we're probably not the only species that suffers when those bonds are broken. Here's where things get really philosophically interesting. Even if we accept that animals can grieve, even if we acknowledge that they show sophisticated responses to death, we still have to grapple with the question of understanding versus instinct. Think about it this way. Humans have plenty of instinctual responses to death too. We have an automatic startle response to sudden movements that might indicate danger. We have built-in tendencies to avoid decomposing bodies, probably evolved to protect us from disease. We even have instinctual caregiving responses that make it difficult for parents to abandon their children, even when those children have died. But we also have something else. We can think about death abstractly. We can imagine our own death. We can understand that death is inevitable, that it happens to everyone, that it's permanent. We can feel existential anxiety about mortality even when no one around us is dying. So when we see animals engaging in death-related behaviours, the key question becomes, are they just following evolved scripts, or are they also capable of abstract understanding? The answer, as you might expect, probably varies by species and individual. But there are some intriguing clues that suggest at least some animals might be capable of more abstract thinking about death than we once believed. Consider this. Many of the behaviours we've discussed require animals to override their basic survival instincts. An elephant mother who spends days trying to revive her dead calf is choosing to focus on that activity instead of eating, drinking, or protecting herself from predators. A dolphin pod that carries a dead member for miles is expending energy and potentially putting themselves at risk. These choices suggest decision-making that goes beyond simple instinct. The animals seem to be weighing the importance of their response to death against other survival needs, and choosing to prioritise the death-related behaviour. There's also the flexibility of these responses. If they were purely instinctual, we'd expect them to be very rigid, very predictable, but instead, animal responses to death show remarkable variation. Some elephant mothers carry dead calves for days, others seem to accept the death more quickly. Some dolphin pods engage in elaborate supporting behaviours, others don't. This variation suggests that individual experience, personality, and perhaps even understanding play roles in how animals respond to death. Even more intriguing is evidence that some animals might be capable of anticipating death. Elderly elephants, for instance, often seek out quiet, secluded areas when they're dying, almost as if they understand what's happening to them. Some domestic animals show similar behaviour, becoming withdrawn and seeking out hiding places when they're seriously ill. Dr. Mark Beckhoff, a cognitive ethologist, argues that this anticipatory behaviour suggests a level of self-awareness and understanding of mortality that goes well beyond simple instinct. After all, if an animal can recognise that they're dying and respond appropriately, that implies some understanding of what death means. There's also the matter of how animals respond to human death. Wild elephants have been observed showing the same kind of reverent behaviour around human bodies that they show around elephant remains. They've been seen covering human bodies with branches and leaves, standing quietly nearby, returning to the site repeatedly. This cross-species recognition of death suggests that at least some animals might understand death as a general concept, not just something that happens to their own species. That's a pretty abstract understanding, one that requires recognising something fundamental about the nature of life and consciousness that transcends species boundaries. Of course, we're still a long way from fully understanding the inner experiences of other species. We can observe behaviours, measure brain activity, and draw inferences, but we can't directly access what it feels like to be a grieving elephant or a mourning dolphin. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the question isn't whether animals understand death exactly the way we do, but whether they experience something meaningful when confronted with mortality, something that deserves our respect and recognition, regardless of how it compares to human experience. There's a concept in psychology called theory of mind, the understanding that other beings have thoughts, feelings, and experiences that are different from your own. It's considered one of the hallmarks of sophisticated cognition, and it's closely related to another crucial concept, self-awareness. Here's why this matters for our exploration of animal death awareness. If you can understand that you exist as an individual being, if you can recognize yourself as separate from others, then you're potentially capable of understanding that individual beings can cease to exist. Self-awareness and death awareness might be intimately connected. The mirror test, developed by psychologist Gordon Gallup in the 1970s, has become the gold standard for measuring self-awareness in animals. The test is elegantly simple. Researchers mark an animal with a coloured spot while they're anaesthetised, then observe how they react when they see themselves in a mirror. Animals that pass the test recognise that the mark is on their own body and try to touch or remove it. It sounds simple, but it's actually incredibly sophisticated. To pass the mirror test, an animal has to understand that the image in the mirror is a reflection of themselves, not another animal. They have to recognise their own body as belonging to them. They have to make the cognitive leap from, I see a body with a mark, to, that body is my body, so the mark is on me. The species that consistently pass this test read like a who's who of cognitively sophisticated animals. Great apes, elephants, dolphins, some magpies, and a few others. Interestingly, these are also many of the same species that show the most compelling evidence of death awareness. This might not be a coincidence. Dr. Gordon Gallup himself has argued that self-awareness and awareness of mortality are closely linked. If you can recognise yourself as an individual being, you can potentially understand that individual beings die. If you can imagine yourself, you might also be able to imagine yourself not existing. There's some fascinating evidence for this connection. Chimpanzees that pass the mirror test are more likely to show sophisticated grief responses when group members die. Elephants, which show clear self-recognition abilities, also show the most elaborate death-related behaviours. Dolphins, another mirror test success story, engage in complex responses to death that suggest deep understanding. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some researchers have suggested that self-aware animals might actually be capable of death anxiety, the uniquely human experience of being afraid of our own mortality. Think about what that would mean. Humans don't just grieve when others die. We also live with the knowledge that we ourselves will die someday. This awareness shapes how we live, how we love, how we make decisions about what matters. We call it existential anxiety, and it's considered one of the defining features of human consciousness. But if elephants can recognise themselves, if they understand that death happens to beings like them, might they also experience some version of this anxiety? When an elderly elephant seeks out a quiet place to die, is that just instinct? Or is it the action of a being who understands what's happening and wants to face it with dignity? We can't know for certain, but there are tantalising hints. Some captive elephants have been observed becoming agitated when they encounter elephant skeletons, almost as if they're disturbed by the reminder of mortality. Some great apes show what appears to be fear or anxiety when confronted with dead members of their species. Dr. Ernest Becker, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, argued that awareness of mortality is both the source of human anxiety and the driver of much of human culture and achievement. We create art, religion, and meaning partly as ways of coping with the knowledge that we will die. If some animals also possess this awareness, what does that say about their inner lives? Do they also need ways of coping with mortality awareness? Is that what we're seeing in elephant burial rituals and chimpanzee grief responses? Not just reactions to death, but attempts to create meaning and comfort in the face of mortality? It's a profound question, one that pushes us to reconsider the boundaries between human and animal experience. Maybe we're not as unique as we thought. Maybe the burden and beauty of mortality awareness is shared more widely across the animal kingdom. And maybe that's not something to fear, but something to find deeply comforting. The knowledge that we're not alone in our struggle to understand and cope with the mystery of death. One of the most important factors in understanding animal death awareness is context. How animals experience and respond to death can vary dramatically depending on their environment, and this difference tells us a lot about the nature of their understanding. In the wild, death is an ever-present reality. Predation, disease, injury, old age, mortality is woven into the daily fabric of life. Wild animals are constantly making decisions based on the possibility of death, constantly alert to dangers that could end their lives or the lives of their family members. This constant exposure might actually enhance their understanding of death. Wild elephants, for instance, encounter the bones of their ancestors regularly as they move through their territories. They've seen predation, they've witnessed the gradual decline of elderly family members, they've experienced the sudden loss of herd members to drought or disease. In this context, their sophisticated responses to death make sense as both emotional reactions and practical learning experiences. Each encounter with death teaches them something about the dangers in their environment, the fragility of life, the importance of social bonds. But wild animals also have the freedom to express their grief responses naturally. That elephant mother who wants to carry her dead calf can do so for as long as she needs to. The pod of dolphins that wants to support a deceased member can take the time and energy to do so without human intervention. Captivity changes everything. In zoos, wildlife parks, and research facilities, death is often medicalized, controlled, sanitized. When an animal dies in captivity, the body is typically removed quickly for health and safety reasons. The natural process of grieving, of gradually coming to terms with loss, is often interrupted. This can have profound effects on the surviving animals. There are numerous documented cases of captive animals showing signs of distress when companions are removed after death, searching behaviours that persist for weeks or months, depression-like symptoms that suggest they never quite understood what happened to their friend. Dr. Gay Bradshaw, a psychologist who studies animal trauma, argues that this interruption of natural grief processes can actually be traumatic for animals. Just as humans need time and ritual to process loss, animals might need their own version of closure. Some zoos and research facilities have started to recognize this. They now allow surviving animals to spend time with deceased companions before removal, understanding that this contact might be crucial for processing the reality of death. The results have been encouraging. Animals that are allowed this contact often show fewer long-term behavioural problems and seem to adjust more quickly to the loss. But captivity also provides unique opportunities to study animal death awareness. In controlled environments, researchers can observe behaviours more closely, document responses more systematically, and even conduct controlled studies that would be impossible in the wild. Some of the most compelling evidence for animal death awareness has come from captive settings. The funeral-like gathering of chimpanzees around Dorothy's body wouldn't have been captured if not for the controlled environment of the sanctuary. The detailed observations of elephant mourning behaviours have often been made possible by the ability to observe individual animals over long periods in captivity. There's also an interesting difference in how different species adapt to death in captivity versus the wild. Some animals, particularly those with complex social structures, seem to maintain their death-related behaviours even in artificial environments. Elephants in captivity still show mourning behaviours. Dolphins still engage in supporting behaviours. Primates still grieve. Others seem more affected by the change in context. Some bird species that show elaborate responses to death in the wild show much simpler reactions in captivity, suggesting that their natural behaviours require specific environmental conditions to fully express. This difference might tell us something important about the nature of death awareness in different species. Animals that maintain consistent responses, regardless of environment, might have more deeply ingrained, more cognitively sophisticated understanding of death. Those whose responses change dramatically with context might be more dependent on environmental cues and social learning, but perhaps the most important lesson from comparing wild and captive responses is that death awareness, like many aspects of animal cognition, is deeply contextual. It's not just about what animals can understand in principle, but about how their environment shapes and constrains their ability to express that understanding. This has important implications for how we care for animals in human-controlled environments. If animals do experience grief, if they do have some understanding of death, then we have a responsibility to consider their emotional needs when designing captive environments and managing their care. As we come to the end of our gentle journey through the evidence for animal death awareness, it's worth taking a moment to consider what all of this means, not just for our understanding of animals, but for our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. If animals can grieve, if they can understand death, if they can experience something like the existential awareness that we've long considered uniquely human, then we're not as alone as we thought. The burden of mortality awareness, the weight of knowing that all things end, might be shared across many species. In some ways, this is humbling. It suggests that our vaunted human consciousness, our sophisticated understanding of life and death, might be more of a continuum than a sharp dividing line. We're not standing apart from the natural world in our awareness of mortality. We're part of a broader community of conscious beings, all grappling with the same fundamental reality, but in other ways, it's profoundly comforting. The elephant mother who won't leave her dead calf, the dolphin pod that supports a deceased member, the chimpanzee who gently touches the face of a departed friend. These behaviours speak to something universal about the experience of love and loss. They suggest that grief, far from being a uniquely human burden, might be one of the most fundamental expressions of consciousness and connection. This recognition has practical implications too. If animals can experience grief, then we need to consider their emotional well-being in how we design zoos, manage wildlife, and even make decisions about farming and animal use. The suffering that comes from loss isn't just physical, it's emotional, psychological, deeply meaningful to the creatures experiencing it. It also changes how we think about conservation. We're not just preserving species or ecosystems, we're protecting communities of beings who form deep emotional bonds, who experience loss, who might even understand their own mortality. The death of the last member of a species isn't just an ecological tragedy. It might also be a tragedy of consciousness lost, of a unique way of experiencing and understanding death that disappears forever. There's something else too, something that touches on the very nature of meaning and mortality. Humans have long sought comfort in the face of death through religion, philosophy, art and culture. We create meaning in part as a way of coping with the knowledge that life is finite, that everything we love will eventually end. But maybe we're not the only ones doing this. Maybe those elephant burial rituals, those dolphin vigils, those chimpanzee funeral gatherings, maybe they're not just instinctual responses, but attempts to create meaning, to find ways of honouring and remembering, to cope with the reality of loss. If that's true, then animals might be engaging in their own forms of meaning-making, their own ways of finding comfort and connection in the face of mortality. They might not build cathedrals or write poetry, but they might touch bones with reverence, stand vigil through the night, carry their dead with dignity. These might be their cathedrals, their poetry, their prayers. Dr. Carl Safina, a marine biologist and author, puts it beautifully when he writes about watching animals grieve. The evidence is overwhelming that animals feel, that they have emotions, that they suffer. But more than that, they seem to create their own ways of dealing with loss, their own rituals of remembrance. This doesn't diminish human uniqueness or our language, our technology, our complex cultures are still remarkable. But it does suggest that we're part of a larger story, a broader community of conscious beings all trying to make sense of existence and mortality. Perhaps most importantly, recognizing death awareness in animals changes how we think about our relationships with them. If other species can understand loss, can experience grief, can form deep emotional bonds that death can break, then our interactions with them carry greater moral weight. The cow separated from her calf, the elephant matriarch shot by poachers, the dolphin caught in fishing nets. These aren't just biological events, but tragedies that might be understood and felt by conscious beings who know what death means. But there's hope in this recognition too. If animals can grieve, they can also love. If they can understand loss, they can understand the preciousness of what they have. If they can mourn the dead, they can cherish the living. And maybe, in their own quiet ways, they can teach us something about how to face mortality with grace. The elephant who stands vigil through the night, the dolphin who supports a friend to the very end, the chimpanzee who offers one last gentle touch. These are lessons in how to honour life, how to face death with dignity, how to love fully even knowing that all things end. In the end, the question of whether animals understand death might be less important than what their responses to death teach us about the nature of consciousness, compassion, and connection. Whether driven by instinct or understanding, by emotion or cognition, their behaviours speak to something profound about what it means to be alive, to care for others, to exist as conscious beings in a world where everything is temporary. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll think differently about the other creatures sharing this planet with us. Perhaps you'll see them not just as biological entities following programmed behaviours, but as fellow travellers on the journey of consciousness, fellow beings grappling with the same fundamental mysteries of existence and mortality that keep us awake at night. In their grief, we might recognise our own. In their attempts to make sense of death, we might see our own struggles reflected back. And in their capacity to love deeply, despite knowing that all things end, we might find inspiration for how to live our own precious, temporary lives. The next time you see a dog sleeping peacefully beside his favourite spot where his companion used to rest, or read about elephants returning to touch the bones of their ancestors, or watch footage of dolphins supporting a friend through their final journey, remember, you might be witnessing something sacred, something that connects all conscious beings in the face of our shared mortality. Death, it turns out, might not be the great divider we thought it was. Instead, it might be one of the things that connects us most deeply to the other conscious creatures with whom we share this brief, beautiful, impossible experience of being alive. And perhaps that's the most comforting thought of all, that in our deepest moments of loss and longing, in our struggles to understand what death means, we are not alone. We are part of a vast community of beings who love, who lose, who remember, and who somehow find ways to keep going despite knowing that all journeys eventually come to an end. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this exploration. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. All of us conscious creatures doing our best to understand this strange and beautiful thing called existence.